Hello, I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico, and this is New Mexico History in 10 Minutes. To paraphrase J.R.R. Tolkien, in 1914, the world was changing. It's no wonder he wrote something like that because it was during World War I, which started in that year, that Tolkien came up with the idea of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. For New Mexico, the years 1914 to 1945 were transformative. World War I lasted from 1914 to 1918. And it was a war, on the one hand, about nothing, but on the other hand, it was about something or some things. And those things were, at least to sum it up, nationalism, especially unhealthy nationalism, the obsession that one's nation is better than other nations, uh, militarism, an obsession with military technology and the need and desire to test out new weaponry and technologies on other nations, and pouring most of a country's resources into the military. And ultimately, a series of treaties between nations that collapsed on themselves once the Shah heard around the world took place, bringing Austria-Hungary into a war with Sarajevo, and then the Russians coming to their aid, and then Germany coming to Austria's aid, and then France coming to Russia's aid, and England jumping in to help France. It was a powder keg that was inevitably going to explode. Um, at that time, the United States was not a major world player. Those nations in Europe had like million men armies. The United States had about 100,000. So think about that and keep that in perspective. There's this idea that we ran in to fight in that war. We didn't. We actually stayed out of it until 1917. And first, we were helping with supplies and helping back in places like England, but ultimately we get involved, especially in the trench warfare of France. My own great uncle, Roberto Lovato, went to fight in France and he lived to tell the tale, but a lot of New Mexicans went. We had a pretty high per capita of Nuevo Mexicanos of all backgrounds that went to fight in World War I in Europe. Well, uh, once the war ended, one of the unfortunate uh, offshoots of that war was the spread of the Spanish flu, a devastating pandemic that killed millions of people around the world. Um, it wasn't Spanish, actually. It originated in Asia and then made its way to Europe, and then soldiers fighting from all over the world in Europe caught the flu and then took it home with them. And so in New Mexico, because we had no health services or a Department of Health, the local population, especially the pueblos and the Hispanic towns and the farming communities, were hit especially hard. Um, there were mask mandates in some towns, and there were attempts to stop the spread of the Spanish flu with the closures of theaters and churches and other institutions. Ultimately, though, the situation settled down after a couple of years from about 1918 to 1919. The 1920s, obviously, all over the United States, saw an explosion of partying, the Roaring Twenties, because people felt a need to celebrate and let it all hang out after a world war and a worldwide pandemic. But in New Mexico, I need to mention in 1921, a man named Holm Bursam introduced a bill to the local New Mexico government attempting to take land from the Pueblo people. The idea being that if um, Americans had settled on Pueblo land and lived there for a certain amount of time, like 10 years or so, they would be given that land. They would have a right to that land. Well, the Pueblos would have none of this. They sent representatives to Washington, D.C. To fight for their right to keep their land. This wasn't their first rodeo. They had been fighting for their lands in the 1600s and the 1700s when Spanish settlers would encroach on their land and when they would encroach on each other's land. And then the same thing in the 1800s. But by 1921, you would think this sort of thing would be over. But Bursum's bill ultimately was defeated in 1923. Interestingly, it was also with the help of women's groups that came to fight alongside the Pueblo people to maintain their land base. So the 1920s were typical in some ways of other parts of the United States. We saw an explosion, though, if I can use that word, after talking about war, of interest in New Mexico by artists and authors. We know the famous people with names like Mabel Dodge Lujan and Georgia O'Keeffe. They start to come to New Mexico in this period, the 1920s. They find the light, the big sky, the amazing landscape and people and the architecture fascinating, exotic, and downright peaceful compared to places like Los Angeles or New York City. D.H. Lawrence finds a home here, and so does Willa Cather. This is also when we start seeing things like the Entrada, the celebration of Diego de Vargas' reconquest of New Mexico and supposed peaceful contact with the Pueblo people in the 1690s, reenacted. This was part of a movement throughout the United States to celebrate pioneer activities and pioneer traditions. And small towns and big towns all over the United States started to have these sorts of events. And this starts in New Mexico in this period as well. I've already spoken in another episode about New Mexico's role in World War II with the development of the atomic bomb. But another major contribution by New Mexico and other states were the Navajo code talkers. I've always been intrigued and fascinated because the fighting armies of the United States and Japan and Germany, England, Russia, all these different places, they actually were able to crack each other's codes a lot because of the familiarity with the languages. There are people in the United States, Japanese Americans who knew Japanese. The Japanese could learn English, but the Diné language of the Diné people, the Navajo, they were able to create codes of communication that the Japanese could not crack. They could not break that code. And it led to major victories for the United States in the Pacific Theater during World War II. So it's important that we recognize this because for the longest time, the United States would forbid the Navajo from speaking or learning their language in an attempt to force them to assimilate. The same was done to Spanish speakers in New Mexico. They were not allowed to speak Spanish in schools. And it wasn't just Hispanics this happened to. Chinese immigrants, Italian immigrants, they were also forbidden in schools to speak their mother languages. Nonetheless, in a twist of fate, it was the Diné language that would contribute to the American effort in World War II and help us defeat the Japanese. So that's a major contribution New Mexico made in World War II, not to mention all the men and women of all different backgrounds in New Mexico who served in the Pacific Theater and in Europe to defeat totalitarianism and fascism in those parts of the world. So that's it for now. New Mexico history in 10 minutes. I'll see you soon. Hasta pronto. Goodbye.